The lecture theater at Harwick University smelled the way it always had: floor polish, old wood, and the particular staleness of a room that had absorbed decades of chalk dust and nervous energy. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October, and the heating had not yet been turned on for the season. The students sitting in the tiered rows kept their coats on. At the back of the room, near the service corridor, a man in a gray maintenance uniform was replacing a strip of fluorescent lighting above the emergency exit. His name was Gerald Fenn, and he had worked the day shift at Harwick for 11 years. He was 53 years old. His hair had gone the color of old pewter, and his hands, broad and deliberate, moved around the fixture with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done the same task several hundred times. He did not look at the lecture theater below him. He was not supposed to be there during class hours, but the work order had come in at noon, and the fixture had been flickering for 2 weeks, and the facility supervisor, a man named Clive, had told him to get it done before the weekend. Gerald climbed down from the stepladder, folded it quietly, and was about to carry it back through the service door when the professor at the front of the room said something that made him stop. "This problem," the professor said, "has not been correctly solved in a published proof in 31 years. Gerald stood with the folded ladder under one arm. He looked at the board. The professor was a woman in her early 60s, trim and straight-backed with silver hair cut close to her skull. Her name was Professor Harriet Osgood, and she held the Whitmore Chair in Applied Mathematics at Harwick. She had published 4 books. She had turned down an offer from MIT in 2009 to stay in Halifax. She did not suffer careless thinking, and her students knew it. She had written a sequence on the whiteboard, not a simple equation, but a structured proof in 6 stages, the third line of which contained a notational branch that folded back on itself in a way that made Gerald's chest tighten slightly, the way it always did when he saw something pulled almost to its correct shape, but not quite there. He told himself to leave. He had 3 more work orders before 4 o'clock. "I want each of you to look at the third line," Professor Osgood said. "I want you to tell me where the logic breaks." Silence in the room. 62 students, graduate level. Some of them were 25 years into their education. They looked at the board the way people look at a car accident, carefully and with a small amount of relief that it was not theirs. Gerald looked at it too. He had not set foot inside a university classroom since 1994. He had enrolled at Dalhousie in his early 20s, mathematics and theoretical physics, and he had done well enough that one of his professors had called him, in writing, "the most naturally intuitive student I have encountered in 20 years of teaching." He had left in his 3rd year. His mother had gotten sick. There had been no one else. He had taken the first job he could get, and then another, and then time had passed in the particular way it does when you are managing something difficult, and the shape of his life had settled around him the way scar tissue settles, quietly, and with a permanence he had never quite intended. He became a maintenance worker. He was good at it. He was good at most things he turned his attention to, and he turned his attention to work and to his daughter, Elaine, and to the small house in Dartmouth that needed constant attention, and to the Saturday morning crosswords he did alone at the kitchen table with his 2nd cup of coffee, and to the books he read at night, not popular books, but the kind of books that required patience and returned something in proportion to the effort put in. He was not unhappy. He had made something real out of what he had, but he knew what he was looking at on that board. He knew it the way you know the face of someone you once loved, not with effort, but with a recognition that sits below thought. The third line was wrong, not wrong in a careless way. Wrong in the way that a beautiful argument can be wrong, internally consistent, superficially convincing, and flawed at its root. The branch notation at line 3 assumed a commutative property that held in standard cases, but collapsed under the specific boundary condition Professor Osgood had introduced at line 1. It was subtle. It was the kind of error that passed through peer review because the reviewers were checking the logic within each step rather than the interaction between the steps. Gerald had seen it in approximately 4 seconds. He stood with his ladder and did not move. "Anyone?" Professor Osgood said. Her voice was not unkind, but it was not soft either. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 40 years separating what was real from what only looked good. A young man in the 3rd row raised his hand. He was wearing a navy wool sweater and had the kind of easy confidence that comes from having been told, repeatedly, that he was brilliant. His name was Tristan Vane, and he was 26, and he had an undergraduate degree from Queen's and a master's from Toronto. And he was, by all accounts, the most promising doctoral student in the department. He said something about the summation index in line 5. Professor Osgood listened. She nodded, slowly, the way a person nods when they are being polite. "That's a reasonable observation," she said. "It's not the error I'm referring to." Tristan Vane sat back. He looked at the board again. He did not raise his hand a second time. Gerald looked at the exit. He looked at the board. He looked at the exit again. Later, he would not be able to tell you exactly why he did what he did. He was not an impulsive man. He had not done anything impulsive in 30 years. He would say, if pressed, that it was simply that the error was there, and he could see it, and something in him that had been very quiet for a very long time was tired of being quiet. He set the ladder down against the wall. It made a sound, and several students turned. He walked down the side aisle toward the front of the room. He was aware of how he looked. The gray uniform, the name badge clipped to the breast pocket, the work boots. He was aware of the students watching him the way you watch a wrong thing happening, and haven't yet decided whether to intervene. Professor Osgood turned. She looked at him. She took in the uniform, the badge, the quiet deliberateness of his approach, and her expression did not change, which Gerald found obscurely reassuring. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was unhurried. It always was. "The error is in line 3. A sound moved through the room. Not a laugh, something more uncertain than that. Professor Osgood looked at him steadily. "The error," she said, "is in line 3. Yes, and you believe you can identify it." It was not quite a question. Gerald understood that. He had dealt with that particular tone before. Not hostile, not dismissive, but careful in the way that people are careful when they are not sure what they are dealing with. "The branch notation assumes commutativity," he said. "It holds in the general case you've been working from, but you introduced a non-symmetric boundary condition in line 1. Under that condition, the commutative property doesn't hold, and the branch collapses. Everything from line 4 onward is built on it." The room had gone very still. Professor Osgood looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at the board. She was quiet for long enough that several students began to shift in their seats. "Come up here," she said. Gerald walked to the board. She handed him a marker. He was aware that 62 graduate students were watching a man in a maintenance uniform approach, a proof that had not been correctly resolved in 31 years. And he was aware that this was, by any reasonable measure, an unusual situation, and he set all of that to one side and looked at the board. He wrote for a long time, not quickly, he wasn't performing, but with the careful, unhurried attention he gave to everything. He worked through the correction at line 3, showed why the commutative assumption failed, restructured the branch, and then carried the corrected logic through lines 4, 5, and 6 to their conclusion. He stepped back. The room was quiet in a different way now. Not the quiet of people watching something strange. The quiet of people watching something they did not expect to be real, turn out to be real. Tristan Vane in the third row was looking at the board with an expression Gerald recognized. The particular expression of someone recalibrating. He had worn it himself at 22, the first time a professor had shown him that what he thought was insight was only the beginning of insight. Professor Osgood had not moved. She was reading the corrected proof with the focused attention of someone who does not let themselves believe something simply because it appears correct, and Gerald respected that. He waited. She turned to face him. "Your name," she said. "Gerald Fenn." She looked at the name badge on his breast pocket, then back at his face. There was something in her expression that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but something between them, the look of a woman adjusting a long-held assumption. "Gerald," she said. "Where did you study?" "Dalhousie," he said. "3rd year. I didn't finish." She nodded slowly. "When?" "Left in 94. Another silence. Someone in the back row coughed. "Why?" Professor Osgood said. "Are you replacing light fixtures in my lecture theater?" Gerald considered the question. It was a fair question. It had several true answers. He chose the simplest one. "Someone has to," he said. A student in the 2nd row made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a breath. The sound of a person encountering something they did not have a category for. It was a young woman in a dark green jacket, and her name was Fiona Calloway. And she would later tell her mother that she had gone into that lecture hall expecting to learn mathematics and had come out feeling she'd been shown something else entirely, though she couldn't quite name what. Professor Osgood looked at Gerald Fenn for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the class. "What you have just witnessed," she said, in her precise, unhurried way, "is what it looks like when someone actually understands the structure of the problem rather than the surface of the solution. I want you to look at that correction for the remainder of this period, and I want you to be honest with yourselves about why none of you saw it." She paused. "That is all." It was not a dismissal of Gerald. It was the highest compliment she was capable of giving, and it was also, he understood, a lesson she was delivering while she had the chance. He had watched her teach for 11 minutes and he already knew that about her. He collected the marker and set it on the ledge beneath the board. "Thank you," he said to her. She looked at him with something that had, he thought, the shape of curiosity. "Don't leave yet," she said quietly enough that only he heard it. Then she turned back to her students, and Gerald stood near the board, and the heat came on somewhere deep in the building with a low metallic sound, and outside the tall windows the October light had gone the color of cold copper. She found him in the corridor afterward. He had collected his ladder and his tool bag and was heading for the service lift when he heard her footsteps behind him. Unhurried, deliberate, the walk of someone who had decided to do something and was doing it. "Mr. Fenn," she said. He turned. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I would like you to answer honestly, which I suspect will not be difficult for you." He waited. "That proof," she said. "Have you seen it before?" "I've read versions of it," he said. "Papers from the late 80s, early 90s, I read a lot." He paused. "I have time in the evenings." She looked at him, not through him the way some people look at maintenance staff, and not with the particular careful warmth people use when they're trying to demonstrate that they are the kind of person who treats everyone with equal respect. She looked at him the way she had looked at the board, with genuine attention, working out what was in front of her. "I'm going to make you an offer," she said. "I want you to consider it seriously before you answer." "All right," he said. "There is a research position in this department," she said. "It is technically a research associate position, which means it does not require a completed degree. It pays considerably less than it should, and the hours are irregular, and you would be working on problems that have, in some cases, resisted resolution for decades. I have one vacancy. I have been looking for the right person for 14 months. She paused. "I am aware that this conversation is unusual." Gerald looked at her. He thought about his work orders. He thought about Clive, his supervisor, who was a decent man and had always treated him fairly. He thought about Elaine, his daughter, who was 24 and studying nursing in Fredericton, and who called him every Sunday evening, and who he had told, since she was small, that the point was not what you were given but what you made of it. He thought about the board, the clean, corrected logic of it, the way the proof had held finally from line 1 through to the end. "I'd like to think about it," he said. "Of course," she said. She handed him a business card. He put it in the breast pocket of his uniform, next to his name badge. She turned and walked back toward the lecture hall without looking behind her. Gerald carried his ladder to the service lift. He pressed the button for the basement. He stood with his tool bag and thought about very little in particular, which was something he had learned to do in order to let his mind settle into whatever it was actually working on. He had 3 more work orders before 4 o'clock. He would do them. He would go home. He would make dinner. Something with lentils, he thought. He had a bag of them that needed using, and he would sit at his kitchen table with his second cup of coffee, and he would think, carefully and without hurry, about Professor Harriet Osgood's offer. The lift arrived at the basement. The doors opened on the smell of old concrete and machine oil and the specific quiet of a room that does not know it is in a university. Gerald Fenn walked out and went back to work. He called her the following Tuesday, not Monday. Monday felt rushed, and he was not a man who made significant decisions in a rushed way. He stood in his kitchen at 7 in the morning with his coffee and dialed the number on the card, and when she answered, she said, simply, "Mr. Fenn," in a way that suggested she had been expecting the call and had not been certain it would come. "I'll take it," he said. "If the offer is still open." "It is," she said. A pause. Outside his window, the Dartmouth morning was gray and cold, and a crow was walking along his back fence with the businesslike air of a creature that had somewhere to be. "I should tell you," he said, That I'm not interested in the credential. I'm not going back to finish the degree, or whatever comes next. I want to work on the problems. That is exactly what I am hiring you for, she said. Another pause, shorter. Tuesday afternoons I pick up my daughter, he said. She's home for reading week. Tuesday afternoons are yours, Professor Osgood said, without hesitation. He thanked her and ended the call and stood at his kitchen window with his coffee for a long time. The crow had moved on. The light was changing in the east, going from gray to the pale, watery gold that early November light manages in Nova Scotia when it makes the effort. Gerald Fenn washed his mug and put on his coat and went to give his notice to Clive. Clive, who was 51 and had worked in facilities management for 23 years and had a deep, unpretentious respect for competence in any form, shook his hand and said, "I always thought there was more going on with you than fixtures and floor drains, Gerald." Gerald smiled, not the reflexive smile of someone accepting a compliment, but the quiet, particular smile of someone who has heard a true thing. "There usually is," he said, "with most people." He carried his tools back to the storage room and labeled his equipment carefully and wrote out a handover note for whoever came next. He left the storage room the way he left everything, in better shape than he'd found it, with nothing left undone. It was, he thought, walking out into the November cold for the last time in a gray maintenance uniform. Not a bad way to have spent 11 years. He had learned the building from the inside out. He had learned its weight and its weather, and the particular way it held cold in its concrete core, even when the heating was on. He knew things about Harwick University that no one with a title or an office or a name on a door had any idea existed. He thought that knowledge like that might, in the end, come in useful. He got into his truck, a 2009 Silverado, with 240,000 kilometers on it, which ran well because he maintained it himself, and drove home through the Tuesday morning streets of Dartmouth, past the Tim Hortons and the elementary school and the house on the corner where the old man with the walker had been putting out his garbage at the same time for as long as Gerald could remember. And when he got home, he sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and began, for the first time in 30 years, to write down the problem he had been working on in his head for most of that time. It covered 4 pages before he stopped. Then he went back to the beginning and started checking the logic, line by line, in the quiet and particular way of someone who has learned, not from instruction, but from the long, unsentimental passage of time, that the only work worth doing is the work you're willing to do slowly. Knowledge, he had come to believe, did not belong to the buildings where it was housed, or to the people who held degrees, or to anyone who wore the right kind of clothes, or carried the right kind of title. It lived in the careful attention of anyone willing to give it. He had given it in whatever hours he could find for 30 years. The hours were about to change. He turned to a fresh page and kept writing.